The demon these two detectives had been chasing for 17 years was standing right in front of the police. But they did not draw their guns, and they did not suspect a thing. Because the man was wearing work clothes and driving a lawnmower, he looked like nothing more than a regular groundskeeper. The two detectives asked him for directions to an old church. The man calmly pointed them in the right direction and said he had grown up around there, so he knew the whole coast well. The police car soon drove away, and when the man turned his face again, the terrifying scar finally came into view. He was the green-eared monster the little girl had described years ago, and he was the real mastermind behind all those missing children cases. The evil in Louisiana had never been hiding in the dark. It was standing right where everyone could see it, smiling as it gave the police directions. That is the cruelest part of the final 2 episodes. They were not just chasing a killer in hiding, they were chasing an evil that had already blended into everyday life. The irony is, even when the real killer stood right in front of the police, they still could not recognize him. A few days earlier, Marty and Rust had just reunited at a cheap bar. 10 years had passed. Marty had already left the force and was making a living as a private investigator. He tried hard to look normal, and he tried hard to live like an ordinary man. And to be fair, those 10 years had treated him pretty well. But Rust was completely different. He looked like a ghost who had crawled out of a grave, worn down and exhausted, but his eyes were sharper than ever. He told Marty that Reggie Ledoux, the man they killed in 1995, was never the end of the case, because the man with the scar on his face was still alive, and the innocent children buried under the shadow of power had never truly been saved. At first, Marty did not want to listen, because he did not want to give up the quiet life he had now, and he did not want to step back into that dark swamp again. Most of all, he did not want to face the case they had personally helped close with a lie. Until Rust said one sentence.
Because you have a debt.
What's that mean? I have a debt, huh?
This is the way shit went down in 95. This is on you too, buddy.
That sentence cut straight into the part of Marty he least wanted to admit. Back then, they killed Ledoux, staged the scene, and made everyone believe the case was over. But what if the real killer was still out there, still hurting people? Then they had not just solved the wrong case, they had helped close the door for the darkness themselves. In the end, Marty followed Rust to the storage unit. The walls were covered with victim photos, old case files, and a web of connections tied to the Tuttle family. There were spiral symbols and cult markings everywhere. This was not a normal investigation. It was a map of darkness Rust had built alone over the past 2 years. And all of it proved that Rust had never truly let the case go. He had only hidden himself away and kept digging deeper into the dark on his own. He had broken into Reverend Tuttle's private home and stolen a videotape from his safe. On that tape was the final nightmare of the missing girl, Marie Fontenot. But Marty only watched for a few seconds before completely breaking down.
No! Jesus! You watch all that?
Yeah. I had to see if any of the men took off the mask.
At that moment, Marty finally understood that the piece he thought he had built was nothing more than self-deception with his eyes shut. He had not left the police force because the world had gotten better. He left because he could no longer bear to look at it. But now, Rust had forced the purest kind of evil straight into his mind, and Marty no longer had any excuse to walk away. That night, the two men drank together in Marty's office. Marty talked about why he had quit the force. It was not because he suddenly got tired of being a cop. It was because, during one call, he saw a drug addict almost put a baby inside a microwave. That kind of bottomless evil destroyed the last bit of faith he had in the job. So he ran. He thought that if he left the police force, he would no longer have to face things like that. But the videotape made him understand something. Some evil does not disappear just because you refuse to look at it. Before leaving, Marty went to see his ex-wife, Maggie. This time, there was no argument and no explanation. Marty simply stood at the door and sincerely thanked her. Maggie noticed something was off. She realized he was not there to catch up. He was there to say goodbye. In the past, Marty always tried to use his role as a husband and father to prove that he was still a decent man. But he betrayed his family again and again, painted himself as the victim again and again, and kept expecting everyone else to forgive him. Only in this goodbye did he finally let go of his need for control. And for the first time, he admitted that a big part of why his family fell apart was because of him. After that, the two detectives started going back through the old cases. They discovered that areas near rural schools funded by the Tuttle family had a much higher rate of missing women and children. That meant the killer was not choosing victims at random. He was using schools, churches, and charity programs to hunt among the people most likely to be ignored. To find the man with the scar, they tracked down an old maid who had worked for the Tuttle family for many years. Her memory was confused, but when she heard them mention the scarred boy, she gave them one crucial clue. He was Sam Tuttle's illegitimate grandson, a child with the last name Childress. When Rust showed her the spiral symbol, her expression instantly turned both terrified and fanatical. She kept muttering that death was not the end. That proved Carcosa and the Yellow King were not just the ramblings of madmen. It was a cult language that certain people had been passing down for years. Following the clues, they found Sheriff Gerasi, the man who had helped bury the Fontenot missing person case years earlier. Marty met him at a golf course and casually brought up the old case. Gerasi acted polite on the surface, but he kept dodging the Fontenot case. The more he claimed he could not remember, the more it proved he was part of the cover-up. So Marty and Rust tried a different approach. They tricked Gerasi into going fishing on a boat. He thought it was just old friends catching up, so he did not suspect anything. But the moment Gerasi let his guard down, Rust appeared and held him at gunpoint. Even as their old colleague shouted at them, neither man backed down, because they knew the normal process had already been poisoned by people protecting their own interests. If they wanted the truth, they had to cross the line the police were not willing to cross. When the video of Fontenot's ritual murder played inside the cabin, Gerasi could not hold himself together either. Even Gerasi, who had seen plenty in his life, let out a terrified scream. Faced with undeniable proof, he finally admitted that burying the missing person report had been an order from above. He had only followed instructions. With those words, "I was just following orders," an innocent child's entire life was erased. That is the most frightening part of human nature. Real evil does not always carry a knife. Sometimes it just sits in an office, stamps a document, and deletes a report. Then it turns a missing child into a mistake that no longer exists in the system. Meanwhile, the official detectives were also looking into the old church. They drove all the way to a deserted cemetery and asked a groundskeeper for directions. The man patiently showed them the way. He was polite, calm, and steady. The detectives thanked him and drove away, never realizing they had just missed the real killer. The man turned his head and the scar on his face became clear. It was Errol Childress. The most ironic part is that the official detectives were not lazy. They were investigating too. They were chasing leads too, but they were always one step behind, because they still trusted the official system. And that system was the very wall that had protected the monster all those years. Errol's home looked like a rotting dump. The house was full of flies, clutter, and the smell of decay. The woman living with him had already been mentally destroyed, like a child trapped inside an adult body. Errol talked to her about ascension, cycles, and planes of hell. He acted less like a murderer and more like the servant of some mystical ritual. But behind all that madness was an even crueler truth. He was not a monster who came out of nowhere. He was the result of the Tuttle family's sins breeding over generations. The abuse of the previous generation had become his religion, and through him, it continued to harm the next generation. This was not just the story of one madman. It was an evil raised by bloodlines, power, and silence. At the same time, Rust and Marty's investigation hit a dead end. The breakthrough came from one of the earliest children's drawings. The monster in the drawing had a pair of green ears. Rust tried to find the answer in religious symbols and psychological trauma, but he got nowhere. Then Marty suddenly realized that the green part in the drawing might not be ears at all. It might be paint from a house. They returned to the old address from the Dora Lane case and confirmed it with the homeowner. Shortly before the murder, the house had indeed been painted green. Following the old maintenance records, they found a repair company connected to the Childress family. At that point, the scarred groundskeeper was finally found in the blind spot the official system had missed. This is where Marty and Rust complement each other the most. Rust can see the larger structure of darkness, while Marty can catch the simplest details of everyday life. Without Rust, Marty never would have come this far. Without Marty, Rust never would have put together the final answer. After making their preparations, the two men drove to the address registered under Errol's name. As soon as they arrived, Rust knew they had found the right place. The air was filled with the smell of rot, and the whole yard felt like a corner of the world civilization had abandoned. Marty went inside to use the phone and found the mentally broken woman. Rust saw Errol slip into the woods behind the house, so he drew his gun and followed him in. Step by step, he entered the maze known as Carcosa. Children's clothing hung inside. Bones were piled up. Ritual marks covered the walls and the branches. This was not just a murder scene. It was the kingdom Errol had built for himself, a dark hell made from bodies, lies, and family sins. Rust reached the deepest part and saw the Yellow King idol made of branches and bones. His vision began to twist, and above him, it looked like a spinning galaxy had opened up. Just as Rust was drawn in by that strange cosmic vision, Errol suddenly lunged out of the darkness and drove a long knife into Rust's body. Rust fought back through the pain, but he was quickly overpowered. Luckily, Marty followed the sound and arrived in time, shooting Errol. But the monster did not go down right away. He swung an axe back at Marty. After Marty fell to the ground, Errol moved in to finish him off. The badly wounded Rust used the last of his strength and shot him through the head. The so-called Yellow King finally died on the altar he had built with his own hands. After the police arrived, they found a large number of videotapes and human remains inside Errol's lair. The case shocked the entire country, but true justice did not reach everyone involved. The authorities pinned the crimes on Errol, Ledoux, and a few other men who were already dead. As for the Tuttle family, the news only said there was not enough evidence to prove their involvement. Marty lay in his hospital bed with an unusually calm look on his face, because he knew they were only two ordinary men. They could kill one monster, but they could not easily tear out the ground that had raised him. It was not a perfect victory, but it was not a failure either. At least one more child would never fall into Errol's hands. At least they had torn a hole in that darkness. Late that night, Marty pushed Rust outside the hospital in a wheelchair. Rust looked up at the sky and, for the first time, talked about what he felt when he was near death. He felt himself fading away, and he felt his dead daughter and father waiting for him in the darkness. It was not emptiness. It was not nothingness. It was a peace surrounded by love. That is why he cried after waking from the coma. Not because he was afraid of death, but because he had almost been reunited with his family. This man, who had denied meaning his entire life, finally felt at the edge of death that love was not an illusion. It may not explain the world, but it can make a broken man willing to live again. Marty helped him stand, and the two men looked up at the stars. Rust thought about the past and said he used to believe there was far more darkness than light. But now, he had changed his mind.
You're looking at it wrong. Once there was only dark. Yes, any lights went in.
The most moving part of True Detective Season 1 is not that two detectives solved the case, or that the monster was finally killed. It is that the story tells us people do not automatically become brave just because they have seen darkness. Most of the time, we run away like Marty. We pretend we do not see it. We pretend life can just go on. We can also become hopeless like Rust, dressing pain up as philosophy and mistaking emotional numbness for clarity. But true humanity is not about never being weak. It is about knowing your own weakness and still choosing to turn back. Marty was full of flaws, but in the end, he did not back down. Rust did not believe in the world, but he still risked his life to save his partner. They did not save all of Louisiana, and they did not make every powerful person pay, but they stopped one monster from breathing. And they made the children buried in the dark finally seen by the world. That is enough. Because in a world rotten to its roots, pulling even one child back from the darkness is already a victory.